think with that, it's actually a great time to get started here. So first of all, thank you all for joining. I truly appreciate the time you're giving us. I know that it's a busy time these days, even if you are sitting from home, so we certainly appreciate it. My name is Sam Espinosa. I am the Vice President of Marketing for Nextcaller, and we are absolutely thrilled today to be joined by some leading fraud and customer experience experts, really from across a variety of different backgrounds, that are here today to discuss with all of us the impact that COVID-19 has had on organizations in every industry, specifically those that really need to strike the balance between providing a great customer experience, but also securing the operation. So over the next couple hours, we're going to be looking at the emerging trends that we've seen, how some of the biggest brands today have been responding to these wildly new circumstances, and really what your brands can do to prepare for the future. So we've actually decided to split our group into two different sessions. You're part of that first session right now that's going to look specifically at fraud and help us understand how organizations are being impacted, not just by consumer perceptions, by fraudster activity, specifically because of COVID-19. So our first panel is going to be led by our very own Tim Prugar, who is the Vice President of Operations for Nextcaller. And he's going to talk about the meteoric rise of traffic into contact centers and how that has been a huge blinking red light to signal that fraudsters are out in full force looking to exploit the chaos associated around COVID-19. Just a little bit of housekeeping here before we get started. Each panel will have a question and answer session at the end, but please feel free throughout the seminar to submit your questions to us in written form. In the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A button there that you'd be able to send in questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can by the end of the session. And before finally, last order of business, I'm going to run a poll. Now, we've designed this to help sort of get a feel for our audience and the things that you're experiencing within your own organization. After the seminar, we'll be releasing the results of this poll to allow you to see what other colleagues have said about their organizations, and we'll be able to let you access this as a recording as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Tim Prugar to start the fraud on the two faces of COVID seminar. Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to everyone for making the time to be here today. As Sam said, my name is Tim Prugar. I am the Vice President of Operations here at Nextcaller, and in addition, am the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Communication Fraud Control Association. So presently here in Connecticut, I am without power, but fortunately we have an electric panel planned to drive us through today's conversation. So I'd like to start off with some brief introductions. Rachel, how about you start us off?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Rachel Toback. I'm a white hat hacker. That means that people hire me to tell them where their vulnerabilities are. I'm the CEO of Social Proof Security, and we do that white hat hacking. I'm excited to talk about my experience with fraud, but of course it's legal.
Sam, how about you go next?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sam McMillan. I'm with Experian. I report into part of a line of business we call decision analytics, so that one of the key areas, and we work closely with many clients, is on the identity and fraud side. My personal role is, I lead the technical pre-sale side, otherwise known as sales engineering team, across North America for the decision analytics business, including the fraud business.
Thank you. Simon, how about you go next?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim. I'm Simon Marchand. I'm the Chief Fraud Prevention Officer at Nuance Communication. Nuance being a voice and biometrics business, I now lead their efforts in using voice biometrics to identify fraudsters and help prevent identity theft. And prior to this, I spent a little over 10 years managing corporate security teams and fraud prevention teams in the financial industry and in the telco world.
Thank you, Simon. David, how about you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I am David Fappelhunder. I am a managing director in PwC's Fraud, Corruption, and Economic Crimes. I'm really excited to be here. I've been helping a lot of our clients across financial services, technology, telecom, all navigate the challenges that are a result of COVID, and really trying to help through their plan and focus as they think about how they will emerge coming out of COVID, hopefully in a few months. Thank you.
Great to have you. And Christina, how about you finish us off here?
Hi, I'm Christina Schott. I am the owner of Innovative Fraud Solutions. For the last year and a half, I've been an independent consultant, actually working very closely with PwC and David Fapahanda. I have 17 years of industry experience working for large financial institutions in fraud prevention, identity and access management, as well as authentication.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everyone on the panel for joining us today. I'm excited for this conversation and to hear your thoughts and insights. To start off, before we get into questions, wanted to establish a little bit of a baseline of what we've been seeing here at NextCaller among the industry and our client base that kind of led to be the precursor to today's conversation. So as COVID started, we noticed among our client base an enormous increase in calls into contact centers. And as we began scratching at that increase and looking at what was going on beneath the hood, we found some interesting findings. And actually, in addition to our own internal findings, we commissioned a survey of over 1,000 Americans combined with our NextCaller internal data to understand what is the state of fraud among this increase in volume to the contact center. So to go through a short overview, in as short as 3 weeks into COVID-19, we identified 32% of Americans who said that they'd already been targeted by a COVID-19 related fraud attempt. That had jumped to 39% by week 9 of the pandemic. Over half of the people we surveyed were more concerned about fraud related to COVID-19, and over 40% reported noticing more phishing attempts. So this was the general experience of the American populace that we reached out to. So it shouldn't be too shocking, although the implications certainly are, that fraud trends were tracking really closely with current events. So here at NextCaller, we've been monitoring the call traffic to all of our clients. And in particular, we flag high-risk calls that correlate strongly to fraud techniques like spoofing. So as you can see from the graph here, news of stimulus payments caused a major spike in call volumes and also fraudulent calls, followed by an even larger spike once those checks started going out. So in many of these cases, we observed fraudsters reacting to these events sooner than customers did. And throughout the first 5 weeks of COVID, these fraudsters really continued their assault even when customer call volume slowed. So before we get started with questions, if we look at the high-risk calls to financial services specifically, at their peak, we saw a surge of 50% above pre-COVID levels, with some banks suffering increases of up to 60% higher than previous peak levels. So throughout the COVID pandemic and what continues, we saw an enormous spike in fraudulent calls to contact centers amongst our customer base, and this mirrored what American consumers were experiencing. So we know that fraudsters quickly started their assault, which is a great segue into some questions I have actually for Rachel Toback on our panel. And she's an expert in using social engineering to manipulate call center agents, which was happening in record numbers earlier on. So Rachel, just to start off our conversation, you're a white hat hacker. Can you talk us through the first step you typically take when testing companies for their vulnerability to fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm going to test a company, of course, they have to contract me first, because the only difference between what I'm doing and what a criminal is doing is the fact that I have a contract. The first thing that I do is I hit the call center or customer support. Those are the folks, of course, that are most client-facing, most used to taking requests from folks from the outside world. And so I'm going to try and do some account takeover from that perspective first. Usually I start over the phone, and I might move to email if that's not working, but I generally start on the phone. From there, I might move to folks in like hiring managers, recruitment, folks who are maybe like in finance, so I can try and gain access to their money. But the very first thing that I do is account takeover and affecting their clients from the customer support level.
And Christina, how does that match up with what you typically see when there are fraudsters poking at vulnerabilities?
It measures up very well, actually. So the first part of the process is typically testing your system, testing your process, right? So you probably have some IVR calls coming in. They're testing their SSNs. They're looking to validate the data they have against your financial institutions. And once they've done that, then they bail out to your customer service agent and begin to test your customer service agent. So it very much aligns with what we experience in the contact center from a fraud perspective, is how they initiate that process. And then once they've tested and gathered that data, right, then they initiate the attack. So it very much aligns with what we see.
That's exactly right, Christina. There's so much testing of processes before actually affecting that account takeover. I need to know what questions you're going to ask me to know what I need to find and fish for so that I can then do the account takeover. That's awesome that you catch people like me.
It's not easy. We're working hard at it.
Yeah. Rachel, could you talk a bit about the role that the phone plays in that equation? Obviously, when we talk about systems and defenses, that's a huge spectrum of things that financial service institutions or wireless carriers use. Can you talk specifically about how you leverage the phone as a real attack vector when you carry out these account takeover efforts?
Yeah, the phone is the first thing that I use because it's the thing that people least expect. So a lot of times in their communications on security awareness, they've been told, watch out for a phishing email, right? This is exactly what it's going to look like. They don't always fully understand that I'm going to start with the phone just to get a sense of their processes and who to attack. Then I'll likely use that information I've gathered to move towards account takeover or a phishing email. And so spoofing becomes really important to me because I need to pretend the person that I'm pretending to be, whether that's a vendor and spoofing the vendor's email, making the caller ID say that, whether that is pretending to be an internal employee, like another customer support agent, somebody from another office that I found on LinkedIn and mimicked their voice with my voice changer, or just somebody else who has the authority to tell them what to do, like IT support, for instance. That's generally one of the first things that I'm going to do, and I need to find that phone number, spoof that phone number with my custom software, and then be able to authenticate with them as that individual. So once I know those processes, those are the steps that I take with the phone.
So that certainly covered a lot there, from social engineering to attempts to bypass what might be voice security systems. And I know, David, thinking about financial crimes and AML of insider attacks. So I'd like to hear from Simon, Sam, or David, when you hear that description of the lengths an attacker will go to, how do you respond as an organization to attempt to detect that and to figure that out and ferret that out in as close to real time as you can?
Well, I think it's really good that we're getting those comments from Christina and Rachel, because it's completely aligned with what we see. And one of the things that our customers discover when we start working with them is that not only do they have those, 1,000 or 2,000 cases of account takeovers in a year or in a month, depending on the size of the business, but when you start actually trying to find the individuals that are committing those account takeovers, it takes 3, 4, maybe 5 calls before they actually succeed. So there's a lot more fraudulent calls taking place in the call center than what we actually look at and investigate from a corporate security perspective. And social engineering is still the easiest way for fraudsters to get through. Humans are the biggest vulnerability a business will have. The call center will be the biggest vulnerability. And now that we're working from home in a COVID-19 world, we have individuals that are, very junior, but under a lot of stress, under-supervised, having to deal with tons of new processes. They don't have any resources close to them that can help them. So they get easier and easier and easier to socially engineer for fraudsters. It's much easier to pressure someone into giving up information or skipping steps of an identification process when they're alone at home and no one's actually paying attention to what they're doing.
And I can maybe just add, because I think the point around social engineering is so on the number. We had experienced, to your point, you're seeing a drop in the number of resources that are able to manage the calls, while there's a sizable spike in the volumes, right? Whether it's related to CARES Act or payment deferment. What we also see, and I think Rachel, you touched a little bit on that, these particular account takeover acts are using the tools that we are all theoretically protected against. So for instance, like a dispute, if you look at like a bureau environment as an example, you are a fraudster and you're looking exactly like a normal consumer, putting a social pressure on that call center to dispute an entry or a credit inquiry or a charge against an account. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we've seen around this stuff. I think that the concept of social engineering is the key, is limited resources, higher call volumes, and how do you balance that? And we're all humans. That's where it ultimately comes down to. So I can't agree with you more.
I think to add to this, what we're seeing in the industry is there's a shift in how people work, and then there's a shift in how clients are calling their banks or other kinds of organizations. And because of the shift, there's now changes in norms. And one of the most significant changes, there's an increased handle time in the call center. There's a lot of pressure, as mentioned earlier. So I think that when we look at
I think we lost your audio there for a minute, David.
oh, you guys hear me?
Now we can. It was no doubt insightful, so I wanted to make sure everyone heard it.
So as organizations are decreasing, restrictions and policies to alleviate the backlog in calls and the increase in handle times, they're taking conscious decisions to increase the inherent risks in the call center. And one of the first things that we try to tell people to do is to be conscious about that, to make sure that there is an awareness that we are trying to maintain our customer experience by maybe reducing the number of questions or challenge questions, or what levels of authentications are required because they take so much time to get through in the process. And by making those conscious decisions, then identifying what are the right tools to compensate for those decisions. We've seen a lot, people call out sick, and we saw a lot of people, not show up to work in the contact centers. And so a lot of organizations have tried to accommodate for this, especially in an accelerated manner where they can't implement a new technology. So this now comes into trying to find solutions that actually maintain the risk level, but yet allowing the organization to reduce the handle time and maintain customer service times. And that's right now, a lot of organizations have been focused on for the last month and two during this COVID crisis. The fraud rates, to be honest, are down. A lot of organizations have said that attack rates were down. Well, there are many reasons, we can talk about that later, but what's up is all the handle time and all this noise trying to detect the fraudsters. Also, it becomes even harder. So finding solutions that can identify fraud activity, anomalous activity before the phone rings has been one of the key recommendations that we suggest as the different organizations are reducing their policies around authentication in the care centers. So that's something I would say that is fundamentally shift in a drastic way over the last 2 months.
And that's an interesting point and segue, because there are solutions out there, right? As much as it can sound doom and gloom when we talk about fraud, that it's this incomprehensibly large problem, the fact of the matter is a lot of people, and the majority of the people on this panel, are doing it very well. So Rachel, I'd actually like to ask you about that and hear a little bit. We talked about the successful attempts. I'd like to hear about a time that you got caught and how that happened, and what kind of things you as a white hat hacker go through to attempt to avoid detection, and when that didn't work.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you it's very simple, the easiest way to catch me, and it's using 2 methods of communication to confirm that somebody is who they say they are. There's so many different ways to do this. You could do it as simple as shooting out an email to the email on file when you receive a call. You can send a text to the phone number on file that is supposedly calling you to check that that person is not spoofing their number. You can also use shake and stir methodology to make sure that the spoofing is not coming through. There's so many different things that you can do, but just using that second form of communication is so important. One time that I got caught, I was calling a call center and I'm trying to gain access. I had all the processes down. And I had gotten all the way to the account takeover flow, like the end of the flow before. And then this second time, I gave a call to the call center, had another person pick up the phone, and this person was more strict on their policies. And so they basically said, absolutely, we can do that for you. I just shot you an email, so go ahead and check that out and just let me know if that looks all right. And I'm thinking, I do not have access to this individual's email account. There's no way that I can tell them what that says. I didn't know if it was a code that they sent me, if it was like a confirmation or something like that. I tried to play it off like, oh yeah, I got that. And they're like, great, great. So just walk me through what your thoughts are on that. And I was like, I don't have it. I don't have access to my email right now. And they were like, okay, great. Well, how about you give us a call when you do get that access, or we can help you out another way by you logging in online and letting us know that code up front so that we can see that you are in fact logged in to your account. So there's so many different ways you can do it, but basically not one form of communication, but two, and however you want to do that, whether it's sending a code or making them check something on an alternate method, that's going to stop me each and every time.
So it sounds like making sure that you can trust the authenticity of that number, that you know it's coming from the device it's supposed to, you know that number can be trusted and is authentic. For the rest of the panel, how does that track with what you've been seeing as best practice when it comes to granting access or restricting access in a call center environment?
You know, I think we've seen a lot of companies rely on sending that two-factor authentication, that one-time password via SMS, and I wouldn't be doing my job by not raising the major issue it represents in terms of security. If you successfully perform your account takeover at the telco level, you change the SIM card, you start intercepting every SMS and every traffic, but at the same time, you don't even have to spoof. You can call and just present the number of the client. And you know, with the highest availability of information on the dark web, it's so much easier for fraudsters to just take a couple extra minutes to try to do both attacks so that they can successfully get into your bank account by changing the SIM before. And that's actually what we have seen during COVID-19. I think it was David that was mentioning that fraud rates are going down, and that's true for specific fraud types. You know, in telcos, fraudsters don't take the time to set up an account. They will just try to intercept traffic. They will try to perform that quick account takeover because they know that there's going to be money deposited in a bank account, because the stimulus package payment is predictable. They know exactly how much is going to be deposited, when it's going to be there. So that's why we see that shift in how fraudsters behave. And that's why, you know, with regulations like PSD2 in Europe and 3D Secure 2.0 here, we're starting to look at not only communicating using a second factor, but, you know, reinforcing the importance of adding an inherence factor in your validation. You know, you don't want to just make sure that it's the phone number that you expect them to have, but you want to make sure that you take a voice print, take a fingerprint, a facial recognition step, to make sure that even if someone like Rachel manages to, you know, put on the perfect scheme and intercept a two-factor authentication message, well, she won't be able to replicate someone's voice, for example.
Tim, I would just add that, you know, I think what Rachel highlighted is an awesome technique. It's a low-cost approach to solve some challenges. Unfortunately, you have to use it in the right way. It's not something you can do for every kind of interaction. It's not your base authenticator. It's not maybe your second authenticator. And so what we have provided guidance is to use the technique as Rachel suggested, where it's out of channel, out of band, for the most highest risk, you know, situations, maybe validating a high dollar transfer or payment, or maybe changing an email address on an account. And we think that's great, because what we're seeing in other areas is you can leverage existing tools. So many times organizations have a secure communication. You log onto the portal and your account, you can get an email or, you know, a message from the organization and respond to it. So you can put some instructions or code to validate that person has access out of channel, or which helps, you know, mitigate against SMS interception and other kinds of interception. I think, you know, as we look further, to what Simon mentioned, we see quite a lot of, targeted with SIM swaps, especially around, high value targets like Bitcoin, investors and the like. But the truth is, we also seeing it in other areas. We see where there is P2P payment and other kinds of real-time payment. They will invest the time and effort to go against the carriers to be able to circumvent those SMS messages that are used. And what we think is important for organization is as they think through leveraging SMS, it's not that SMS is a bad a factor, it's just how you use it becomes critical. So before sending an OTP through SMS, you have to ensure that there hasn't been any, on the carrier account, any changes to the account, any SIM swaps, any porting, or anything like that that may have some inherent risk in there, which then gives you a higher confidence level that that one-time password will be delivered appropriately to the intended recipient. I think so. Looking at both of those, those are great opportunities, but there are also the complexity of how do I shift my authentication processes in the call center now in a very technologically challenging area where there's a lot of competing priorities. A lot of organizations were focused on getting out PPP, loan intake, and now they focus on getting out PPP, forgiveness. All tech teams were focused on that, and it's really hard to shift into bringing new kinds of technology. And so what we're also seeing is that where there's an opportunity to offload some of these technologically changes up outside of the company, maybe working with at the carrier level to bring in capabilities with third-party vendors, we're also seeing that you can get these controls in place quicker and faster, and you can use them in a mass market, as a default signal as part for all interactions in the call center. And those, in addition to what Rachel suggested, really gives that extra layer of control that will really provide an enhanced customer experience for the organization.
Thanks, David. I'm fortunate.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I just want to let everybody know I have to go to Black Hat now to do some hacking, but thank you so much for having me on this panel. I know Sam and I are going to chat about having maybe another event in the future, but thank you so much for having me on, and I hope you have a great rest of your conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel.
Sam, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I thought I'd just put David made some really valid points there. A few just comments. So I think when you look at the consumer to institutional contact, I think what's very obvious for us, in our client base, is this sizable shift to digitalized communication, whether you're opening an account or you're managing an account. We have an example of one of the large financials. For instance, their deposit traffic literally doubled online, like just pure account opening. It's quite seismic in how you look at the shift in that. Now, when you double your traffic, if you don't double your defenses, well, you've got that, right? So that's one real big trend that we're seeing. The second sizable trend that we're seeing, most consumer interactions happened in one or the other. So you go to a branch, or you would call, or you would go online. That's been generally the theme. Now, to be able to help with some of the call center resource constraints that you've got with either limited or social distancing, or moving from a big place to a home office, what's happening is now you've moved from, maybe you're moving to online, so portal, app, chatbots, SMS communication. And what you're seeing with that is, and I think that's where the prevalence of account takeover is starting to play into this, is that where maybe there was good protections in online in the branches, maybe the telephone channel is less well protected. The chatbots, we all know, I think everybody feels a level of uncomfort when you're in that space. Then there's SMS. So I think when you look at it, I think in a rapid evolve, you've got mass volume, you've got limited resources, and you've got to try to protect those channels. and I think you guys touched on it really well, OTP, we still feel very strongly around device, digital, and behavioral biometrics, right? Those are, especially when you look at account takeover. Now, maybe one last point, when you look at account takeover, and I think I would maybe point to what David brought in, I think he's nailed it in a lot of ways. Account takeover for us, we look at it and we say, perpetrators of account takeover have two probably diverse opportunities for fraud. There's one what I would just call the first opportunity, which is, I get in, I take the account over, and I, deplete the wealth account, or I deplete the debit account, right? That's one way to look at it. The other part where I think where we're seeing a delay in the fraud manifest itself is harvest credentialing, credential harvesting. So I'm getting over Tim or Simon's data. Now I go somewhere else. I might have a subtly different address, a subtly different email address, but I'm applying for an account with no intent to service that account, right? So I'm harvesting that to get the money. And what we see with identity theft, one of the big growth areas in terms of loss is in first-party fraud. Now, the problem with first-party fraud, you don't see it 30 days afterwards. It's only going to show up in your account book 90, 120 days. So our view on the world is that you're probably going to, that fraud may or may not be there, but we're going to see that trend maybe 60, 90, 120 days out. So I think it's different angles to this. I don't disagree with what you're saying. You probably don't see the amount of fraud just yet, but I think when you're looking at credential harvesting, that will happen, but probably another 3 to 6 months out. There's going to be a lot of loss on the accounts receivable book of a lot of our clients.
I think I'd like to add two topics to this. I think everybody's right on the money here. First, I don't want to forget about the operational pieces to this puzzle, right? So we're here to talk about technology, but a couple things to remember about operations. One, your customer service team, the likelihood of them getting one fraud call a day is incredibly small, right? You have most financial institutions have large customer service teams. Less than 1% of your inbound call volume typically tends to be fraud related. So remember that while you're training them, they don't see those red flags on a regular basis. So playing calls for them, getting them the training that they need to understand what those red flags are is going to be important as you're parallel pathing your technology to help detect that sooner. And especially if you're down the path of not being able to invest in a lot of technology and advancements, there are some things that you can do, like negative lists, right? Implement your negative lists in your contact center and auto route those calls to more specialized teams. So there are things you can do which may have small tech impact or even minimal to no tech impact that allows you to begin to funnel these groups as you're working on the technology strategies. The second thing I'll say for operations is empowering your staff to take action. So we talked about sending OTPs, text OTP or email, or hanging up the call. I find that procedurally, very often, customer service agent doesn't know what to do with that call and perhaps doesn't even have good information on where to route that escalation. So really reviewing your policies to ensure that your people are empowered to take those actions that we're talking about is really important. And you'll probably find that it may not be as clear or concise in your operations procedures. So those are some things that you can do from a human investment perspective that may give you some additional wins in detection and referrals. The second piece I'll say, separate topic, is in relation to the ATO. What we do find is a real big increase in new account opening related fraud, which ties to the first party related fraud that Sam mentioned. I think that what you're going to see with the money movement, right, is a higher increase in mule accounts and sleeper accounts. And in some cases, those accounts look like ATO because they slept for 6 to 9 months, minimal transactions, usually under $200, and then they wake up and they have to change the passwords, they have to change the authenticators, and then they start having money movement. So ensuring that when you look at this, you're looking at it from an account life cycle, a customer life cycle, as well as a fraud life cycle on the areas of vulnerabilities that you will want to invest your assessment time in, to look at that broader type of attack vector.
Tim,
I think that Christina was
I just saw
spot
in the
on.
chat. I'd maybe like to quickly answer that. It's a great question. You know, we and Christina, thank you for that. I think your point around the muling and sort of I call it like resting and then busting out. That's kind of how we look at that model. You know, just the individual that asked me, Laura, just to answer your question, right? So again, this is just our vantage point. Everyone looks at this probably the same, but subtly maybe with different flavors around it. So when we look at identity theft, you know, I love to call it the 90-30 rule. And what we call with that is 90% of the frauds are detected within 30 days. And the way that works is, so I take over David's account, you know, I get hold of David's account or his credentials, I apply somewhere, let's just call it for a TJ Maxx card, and I go on a spending spree. I don't change any of the credentials related to David. So it's his name, his address, his social, the whole lot. And then about maybe 15, 30 days later, David receives the account in the mail and he's like, I didn't apply for this. So within 30 days, 90% of that fraud is coming back through the channel. Call in, you dispute the account, you dispute it on your bureau, you go through that normal process. When it comes to first party fraud though, the credentials are very much a mixed sometimes. It's subtle changes like a social number, maybe an address that's just a little bit different, a telephone number that's a little bit different. The account never makes it to David. And the intent of that is to do what Christina just talked about. Maybe open the account, spend $200. It's not getting very heavily on the radar, and then servicing it. And then going on a, call it on a spend, you know, against that, you know, $5,000. And then just what happens is the credential owner, David, never gets to see that account. From financial institution, it shows up as a delinquent. And that's why that fraud only raises itself up 90 to 120 days, and sometimes even longer. You know, when we do analysis, we even go sometimes as far as a year out in terms of when that fraud actually perpetrates it. So first and third party fraud for us are different ways that they come back to the organization. Third party, it gets told to us. First party, we pick it up in our accounts receivable book because it's never really disputed by the true consumer, if you would.
So it could often sound like we're always on the defensive, that there are so many threats coming from such a variety of places. And Christina, I think you did an extremely helpful job in operationalizing and talking about what the blast radius can be of some of our attempts to thwart fraud. But I'm curious to hear from the panel, obviously, and Christina mentioned, a relatively small number of interactions are fraudulent, and the overwhelming majority are good customers that are looking to be helped and serviced. And so I suppose, just to ask the panel, if you could give a brand one piece of advice for how to preserve that strong customer service while keeping the bad actors out, what would you suggest?
I guess I'm going to jump in that case. You know, for as long as I've been in the fraud prevention domain, fraud teams were always, that's me expression, kind of the party pooper, you know, coming in, breaking into a marketing meeting to tell them that whatever they were planning, there was going to be too much of a risk to move forward. So we needed additional processes in place. And it kind of always, you know, slowing down or making the customer experience full of obstacles, because, you know, our responsibility is to make sure that there's no financial losses tied to a new process, a new product, a new channel that we decide to open. I don't think that with today's technology, we have to make that same trade-off between, you know, good, strong security process and a good, positive, seamless customer experience. You know, I'm talking from a biometrics perspective, but for me, I would much rather remove all security questions from an authentication process, take 2 seconds of audio when someone says, hey, I'm Simon, I want to know my balance, or I want to change my address. That for me is enough audio to make sure that this person is the right person. So it simplifies not only the authentication process, it makes it more secure. I'm not adding obstacles that would have basically no impact on the fraudsters' tentatives because they do have the answers to all the questions anyway. And I'm providing that higher level of security because effectively speaking, replicating your voice, even though we see in the media about deep voices and things like that, it is not a reality today. It's not something that fraudsters are doing. When you deploy biometrics in a system, it just displaces the fraudsters to another organization. So I think that the thought process behind how authentication processes should be designed is shifting dramatically in the past 3-4 years. And we're seeing that it can be seamless, it can be easy, it can be positive while being more secure and ultimately making it a differentiator between two companies. Who do I want to deal with? Will I have to go through several questions that I might have forgotten the answers to, or do I want to go with the other one that will just ask me what's wrong? And it brings us back to that vulnerability that individuals represent in a call center. Social engineering will always happen for as long as you have something that relies on a human being making a decision, a judgment call. If the system tells you that you're allowed to keep talking instead, then your agents will not be so easily pressured into giving up information or letting you go through a process. If your voice doesn't match, it doesn't match, that's it. We escalate the call to the fraud team. So I think that we have to start looking at that. We have to start looking at what technology can I deploy for the future that will make the job easier for my agents, easier for my customers, and at the same time will also be more secure and will also help me stop fraudsters faster, because at the same time you're creating voice prints for individuals, you're doing it for fraudsters. So the minute they call into your call center, you know them, you block them, and they become someone else's problem, basically.
I think that idea of early detection is important. The more information, the more training, as Christina said, the more data and intelligence you can get earlier in the call stream ultimately determines whether it's IVR access, whether it's how you route a call, but having that faith in the authenticity of the number, in the authenticity of the voice, and the authenticity of the actor allows you to act intelligently. David, how does that track with what you see and what you experience as best practice?
I think it's very much in alignment to what we see. I think what is most interesting is that how fraudsters are changing their techniques to blend in so that they can be less likely of them being detected. For example, we've seen fraudsters call in to call centers because they know there is an inundated volume of calls asking for where the stimulus checks are and when the client should expect the government to give stimulus checks. And they start with that as a tactic to provide more credential that it is them and the customer on the call, to develop an empathetic relationship with the call center rep. And they use that and create great narratives to explain why it was so important for them to get their funds and why it was really helpful for them to know when the funds arrive. Completely kind of misrepresenting the true intent of their call. And so as soon as they have achieved that goal of developing that strong empathetic relationship, they then change the tactic to say, oh, by the way, I'm not sure if I'll know when I get this. Could you change my email address or my on file? So could you check that my email address is correct, because I want to get that. And then they'll say, oh no, that's my old one. Someone, my identity was stolen. Can you change it to this new email address? Very similar, which maybe shifting it from a Gmail to Yahoo or something similar. What challenging here is that in the care centers, the number one priority is customer service. And so they feel the sense of gratification that they're solving the client's need in a time, in a difficult time. unfortunately, this behavior is masked by the 1,000 other legitimate calls that have come in. And so what you really need to do is help the agents with more insights so they can make a judgmental decision like Christina mentioned earlier. They're going to be your first line of defense, if you don't have the right upfront, controls. And so bringing in some signals, details around is this a call matching known from, is this a call, a caller ID that matches the account? Has it recently been changed? These kinds of information will at least help them upfront perform some basic assessment and give them the information that they need to then, make following changes. The next thing is monitoring. While it may be difficult to implement in this time, real-time tools, creating reports that can easily monitor for inbound calls and suspicious, changes to account information will help you, with training, like Christina mentioned, to reinforce what is a red flag and what's not. But more importantly, too, usually these call centers are used in a fraud scheme where the call center is the first stop on multiple stops to actually commit into fraud, where funds are actually exfiltrated. So even if you run a daily report that looks at these and start writing some basic, rules to look for this, that gives you a step up, and we've found that to be successful. When you complement that with signals from third-party providers that can really give you information about, is the call spoofed? Is it originating from the true mobile number? Then you can even be more accurate in terms of your detection rate, and you can really be more impactful on taking the remediation actions that you want. Where you have a higher confidence that this is truly anomalous, then you can take the actions of blocking an account, reducing limits, and other kinds of steps. Things that are not easily done in real time, great when you can, but something you can definitely do the next day.
Yeah, I really like what you said, David, about, having the metrics in place and beginning to understand, the performance. I think one thing to add there is, and to your point, right, the call center may be step one of an ultimate process that ends, right? And so when you look at an anatomy of the attack and implementing root cause analysis of these attacks, it will allow you to find areas where you do have the vulnerabilities so that you can hone in on the right third-party technologies to close those gaps. Be very strategic about those gaps that you close. So the metrics and the information will begin to, and the fraud itself will allow you to then have those indicators on where to look and deep dive and look at your broader control environment. Because typically when you have larger attacks, you have multiple breaks in your controls. So the metrics are a really good start, and then beginning to look at your process from more of an end-to-end perspective and root causing these larger events are really going to help. Oftentimes we don't see enough root cause analysis being done, and I think that is an area of focus if you haven't been doing it, to be able to find those key areas. So all the things we're talking about, where and when and how to implement, that will help you define when and the proper timing.
If I can maybe just add a quick note onto that, it's a bit of cliche-ish, right? It's a bit clicky the way we talk about this, but it's probably more prevalent now than ever. Within our organization, our business, we've shifted very much from fraud detection to identity prevention, right? So it seems like it's very cliche-ish, but it's fact. Christina's point's 100%. When we're speaking to customers today, of course we're in the business of loss prevention, and we believe we're doing the morally right thing to stop the bad actors. But most businesses really care about driving revenue and their upside, right? That's just the way it operates today. And where a lot of times we're doing an analysis and a proof of concept, conversation really now starts shifting to, yes, it's kind of nice that you're telling me to save me X amount of dollars on this side, but what's the consumer cost? It goes right down to the false positive, the KPI that says, what's your false positive on this? And we've looked at this, and I think it's it's very cliches, but I think it's not really a cliche, right? The point, I think, Simon, you touched on this a little bit earlier too, the whole concept of a layering into what you're doing. There is some, you're not going to you might catch them with a silver bullet on the phone, but when they move to the chatbot or online, you're going to have some layering. And then I think and so it becomes a technology conversation. However, we hate to think that is where we go to, but that's what, we're somewhat between solutioning and technology all the time. And then when you move to a technology, it becomes imperative that technology is very flexible in terms of self-use for your customer. In other words, changing a strategy, the ability, I think, David, maybe you touched on that, or maybe Christina, around the email. What are we doing if someone says, well, it's not really my email, it's an old email. I'm on the phone. How can I quickly adjust to check that email is actually a relevant email tied to you, Christina, to Sam, to Tim, right? It goes right back to layering. It goes right back to flexibility. And unfortunately, as much as when you look at it from an operational perspective, it does come down to the technology choices that we make to be able to enable this level of layering and flexibility.
So we are nearly at the top of the hour. Thank you for those thoughts, Sam. And I can't help but to be struck that it feels like there's this constant tension between fraud prevention and providing an excellent customer experience. And that's something here at Nextcaller we're tremendously passionate about removing. And we believe strongly those two things. And I think Simon did a great job of speaking about how that becomes a differentiator, is that those two things don't have to live in conflict, and that you can have a fantastically secure customer experience. The idea of the call center being a weak point in the fraud chain, the idea that there are layered solutions to address that. And I think in listening to Christina today, talking about enabling and empowering, either through data or intelligence or training, your agents to truly protect your customers and your organization, are all going to be tremendously important, both in what we've seen of the increasing calls with COVID, but also moving forward in the long tail of fraud trends that come out of that. An enormous thank you to all of our panel participants today. The level of experience and expertise was just top notch. So thank you all for joining us today. And Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Tim. Also, thank you to all of our participants here who have asked wonderful questions in the Q&A. I apologize we haven't gotten a chance to get to more than it feels like we could go another hour on this subject. So I'm glad that everyone is so excited. We will do our best after the session to make sure we follow up on those questions. But now we get a chance to move topics here. So we're going to offer a 10-minute break to everyone who needs to get another cup of coffee, finish off their lunch, walk their dog, all those things we're doing now from home with COVID. Feel free to do that. We're going to start again at 5 after the top of the hour. So please stick around. We've got some really exciting participants next. We have a representative from Hilton Hotels, a representative from BBVA Bank, and we also have Shep Hyken, who is a New York Times bestselling author, influencer, and social customer experience expert. So really exciting panel that's going to get talking about the other half of this, which is how we manage customer expectations. So really hope you guys can stick around, and talk to you soon.